At 17 minutes past 4 on a Monday afternoon in Braddock Falls, Pennsylvania, a folding camp table hit the wet sidewalk outside St. Aloysius Hospital, and 40 apricot pastries went down with it. The woman who'd been baking them since 4 that morning was 29 years old, 7 months along, wearing sneakers with newspaper stuffed in the heels. She didn't scream. She got down on the cold concrete and started saving whatever hadn't touched the ground, and there wasn't much left to save. 3 young men were already laughing their way back into a white Range Rover, and not one person on that street stepped outside. What nobody noticed was the black sedan idling 40 yards down the block. The man in the back seat watched every second of it, and he didn't get out. He didn't call the police. He couldn't have stopped it by then anyway, and he wouldn't have wanted to. Not the way most people would understand it. 14 months later, when somebody finally worked up the nerve to ask him why, he gave one answer and never explained it again. He said, "Because I knew who she was." If stories like this one still mean something to you, hit that like button. It doesn't cost you a thing and it helps more than you know. Share it with someone who needs reminding that decent people are still out there. And subscribe, because we tell one of these every single week. Now let's go back to 4 o'clock that morning, down to a basement kitchen where a woman was baking in the dark. And let's start where it really started. The apartment sat half a story below ground. And in October, in Braddock Falls, that meant the cold didn't come through the windows, but crept up from the floor. Mari Kowalczyk had learned to live with it. She woke before the alarm sounded, as she had every morning since spring, because her body had grown accustomed to waking at the exact hour when she used to hear a key turning in the lock. She didn't switch on the ceiling light. The bulb had burned out the week before, and she hadn't bought a new one. Not because she couldn't afford a light bulb, but because every time she meant to buy one, something else mattered more. She turned on the oven, and the orange-gold glow spilling through its small glass window was the only light in the kitchen for the next 4 hours. Flour, butter, eggs, sour cream, and a jar of homemade apricot preserves made from fruit she'd bought cheaply at the farmer's market at the end of the season. Her grandmother called these pastries kolaczki, and she'd taught Mari how to make them at this very kitchen table, when Mari was so small she had to stand on a chair to reach its surface. Her grandmother died a few months before Wesley. Mari sometimes thought that was the only kindness that year had shown her, sparing the old woman from having to witness everything that followed. She kneaded the dough with the heels of her hands, pushing forward, folding it back, turning it a quarter turn, then pushing again. She did it without looking. Her belly had grown so large that she had to stand with her body slightly angled, placing more of her weight on her left leg, and by the time she was halfway through the batch, her lower back had begun to protest. She didn't stop. If she stopped, the dough would grow cold, and cold dough made hard pastries, and people only bought hard pastries once. On the narrow windowsill above the sink lay a notice from the electric company, sent at the beginning of fall, folded into quarters, and pinned beneath the salt jar. She didn't need to open it and read it again. She'd read it often enough to know it by heart, and the line she remembered most clearly said that the heating would remain disconnected until the debt was paid in full. She'd called them twice. The first time, they told her to apply for winter assistance. The second time, they told her that her application was on the waiting list, and the woman on the other end of the line hadn't sounded unkind, only tired in the way of someone who had repeated the same sentence many times that day. After that, Mari stopped calling. She found another way. Every night, once the final batch had come out of the oven, she left the oven door slightly open, spread a wool blanket across the tile floor in front of it, and lay there on her side until morning. She didn't do it because she was cold. She did it because the doctor had told her that a mother's body heat was the first thing her baby felt, and Mari had decided very early that there would be many things in this world her little girl might have to go without, but warmth wouldn't be one of them. She rested a hand on her belly, over the place where a tiny heel had been pressing upward for the past several weeks, and whispered, "Not yet, sweetheart. Mama isn't finished." The table stood folded and leaning in the corner of the kitchen, its legs bound with a length of rope so they wouldn't spring open when she pulled it up the stairs. It was the camping table Wesley had bought at a second-hand store when they were newly married, back when they both still believed that weekend trips to the lake were something they would do forever. That very afternoon, he'd taken out his pocket knife and carved his initials into one corner of the tabletop. The carving was clumsy, the lines crooked and far deeper than they needed to be, and he'd laughed and said that now no one could steal it. Mari ran her fingers over those 2 letters every morning before carrying the table out of the apartment. She didn't consider it superstition. She only believed that some habits were kept not because they were useful, but because letting them go would leave one more empty place in the house. The first batch came out of the oven before dawn began to break. She arranged the pastries on a tray, covered them with a cloth, and started the second batch. There was a coat still hanging behind the bedroom door, and Mari never touched it. It was the ash-gray canvas coat Wesley wore when he wasn't at work, the one with the engine oil stain on the right cuff that he could never be persuaded to have properly cleaned. And in its left pocket, wrapped in a carefully folded piece of tissue, was the pregnancy test she'd planned to show him that evening. She'd worked it all out. She would cook his favorite meal, wait until he'd finished eating before telling him, and she'd imagined the moment when he understood, the way his face would change from weariness to bewilderment, and then to something she'd never seen there before. She'd imagined it so many times that she was no longer certain whether she truly remembered him or was only remembering that evening that had never taken place. They'd argued that morning. It began with a pale yellow envelope lying on the kitchen table, an electric bill from the previous month that they both knew hadn't been paid. And Mari had finally said what she'd been swallowing for weeks, that he'd taken another night shift without asking her, that she hadn't eaten dinner with him for 11 nights in a row, that she hadn't married a man only to live with a coat hanging behind a door. Wesley didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice, and sometimes that was even more infuriating than if he had. He simply stood there, holding a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, and said he was doing it for her, that he wanted them to move out of that underground apartment before winter came. She said she didn't need a house. She needed a husband who was actually there. He set down the cup. He said he had to go. And then she said those words. The words she hadn't gone a single night without hearing again inside her head. The words she'd repeated thousands of times in the darkness beside the slowly cooling oven. Go on then. Go save the whole world. There isn't anyone here to save me. He paused in the doorway, for the space of a single heartbeat. She thought he would turn around. She stood beside the sink with both hands still wet, waiting, with gentler words already prepared, intending to tell him, "There is something I want to tell you tonight. Don't come home late," but he didn't turn around. He only closed the door, very softly, the way a person did when he didn't want to disturb the neighbors upstairs, and the sound of his footsteps climbing the concrete stairs grew fainter, until it disappeared entirely. That was the last time she ever heard those footsteps. They came to tell her late that afternoon. 2 men in uniform stood at the top of the stairs leading down to her apartment, and she knew before either of them opened his mouth, because no one came all the way to your home to deliver good news. They spoke very slowly and very clearly, and she heard perhaps half of what they said. She remembered asking them a foolish question, whether he'd had time to eat breakfast, and one of the men looked at her with an expression she would never forget. He didn't come home. That was all she allowed herself to think about it for a very long time, because every thought that went beyond those words led her to places a pregnant woman shouldn't go. After the funeral, her mother-in-law said something to her outside the church, while people were still shaking hands, that her boy had taken the night shift because Mari wanted a home of her own. She said it so quietly that no one else heard, and then she walked away. The 2 women hadn't spoken since that day. The pregnancy test remained in the pocket of the coat hanging behind the door, still folded inside its piece of tissue, and Mari left it there untouched for 5 months, because as long as she didn't take it out, there was still one tiny corner of the world where Wesley Kowalczyk hadn't yet heard the news, and as long as he hadn't heard, there was still a chance that someone might tell him. Halloran Street ran along the front of St. Aloysius Children's Hospital, a narrow road paved with asphalt that had been patched again and again, bordered on both sides by red brick buildings darkened by decades of winters and decades of smoke from the steel mill back when it was still operating. On the hospital side stood a row of maple trees that had already shed nearly all their leaves, and by the time Mari pushed her table there, the wet leaves were still plastered across the sidewalk in dark brown patches she had to step around. She set up the table between 2 trees, a few dozen paces from the hospital's main entrance, close enough for people to see it from the lobby, and far enough away that security wouldn't have to warn her. She hadn't chosen this spot because it was crowded. She'd chosen it because she knew what happened inside those walls. People arrived early in the morning and sat all day on plastic chairs in the second-floor corridors, and they forgot to eat. They didn't forget because they were busy. They forgot in the way the body stopped asking for food when the mind was occupied with fear. Wesley had once told her after a long shift that people in moments like those didn't need anyone to comfort them. They only needed something warm to hold in their hands. She'd remembered those words. She arranged the pastries on trays, covered them with a checkered cloth, and propped up a sign handwritten in red marker that read, "Homemade pastries, $3 each. Thank you for helping me bring my daughter home." On the back of the sign, she'd written her full name and telephone number in small letters, just in case the wind blew it away one day and someone found it. Mrs. Delphine Arsenault sat at the corner, where she'd been sitting since before Mari began coming there, behind a smaller table displaying lottery tickets and several newspapers. She was over 70, with short white hair, and an aluminum crutch rested against the side of her chair. Every morning, the two women shared a cup of coffee, bought from the counter, inside the hospital lobby. Just one cup with 2 paper lids, and Mrs. Delphine always paid, always pretending it was only because she already had the exact change. That morning, she watched the passing crowd, and told Mari that some young men liked to cruise along this street in the afternoon, the Ashcombe boys, and that Mari shouldn't get involved with them, should just keep her eyes lowered and mind her own work. Mari asked who the Ashcombes were. The old woman replied that in this town, those blocks out there belonged to them, and whatever didn't belong to them, they believed did. Then she said no more. The pastries sold better that morning than they had on any other day. A man of about 40 came through the main entrance, his face gaunt and his beard unshaven, and stood in front of Mari's table for a long while, as if he'd forgotten what he had meant to do. Then he bought the entire remaining tray, explaining that 4 members of his family had been sitting upstairs since the day before yesterday, and none of them would eat anything. A nurse changing shifts bought 2, took a bite right there on the sidewalk, then looked up and said they tasted exactly like the pastries her mother used to make when she was a little girl in Scranton. An elderly woman paid $5 for one and refused the change, and when Mari tried to say something, the woman merely waved a hand and walked away. By noon, Mari's tin box was heavier than it had been at any midday since summer. She calculated the total in her head, without writing it down or using a calculator, and she realized that if things continued this way, she would have enough before her little girl was born. She turned on her phone to check the time, then immediately switched it off again. It was a prepaid phone, with refill cards bought at the convenience store at the end of the street. And she only turned it on when she truly needed it, because every minute it remained on was another part of the balance slipping away for no reason. At that very moment, Dr. Priya Raghunathan came through the side entrance. She wore a white coat and carried a cup of coffee, and she walked straight toward Mari, gently took her by the elbow, and guided her aside to the sheltered space behind a maple tree. She said she'd reviewed the readings from Mari's most recent examination, that her blood pressure had reached a level she didn't like, and that if Mari was still standing out on the street like this when she reached her 34th week, the doctor wouldn't dare promise her anything anymore. She said Mari had to rest. Mari stood motionless for a moment, still holding the checkered cloth in one hand, then asked what she was supposed to use to pay the hospital bills if she stopped working. Dr. Raghunathan didn't answer. She looked down at the coffee cup in her hand for a long time, then said she didn't have an answer to that question, and she was sorry. A fine rain began to fall in the middle of the afternoon, then stopped, leaving the sidewalk slick and gleaming and the maple leaves plastered in slippery streaks along the curb. Mari had sold nearly all the morning's batch and had just placed the final tray on the table when a white Range Rover pulled up, its 2 front wheels climbing all the way onto the sidewalk before it stopped. Music pounded from inside the vehicle for a single beat, then went silent. 3 young men stepped out, and the one in front had neatly combed blonde hair, the collar of his polo shirt turned up, and an iced coffee cup in his hand nearly half the length of his forearm. He looked at the sign, looked at the tray, then asked how much they cost. Mari said $3 each. He took out his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and held it between 2 fingers, asking whether she could make change. She said she didn't have enough change for $100, but if he came back in a few hours, she would. He laughed, slipped the bill back into his wallet, then reached into the tray and took 4 pastries. He said that in that case, they were on her today. The other 2 laughed behind him, and one of them took out his phone and held it up. Mari set the checkered cloth down on the table. She didn't step back. She straightened and told him to return the pastries or give her $12. The choice was his, but she'd never given away anything she'd had to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to make. She didn't speak loudly. She spoke in the voice of someone trying to keep her hands from trembling. The smile vanished from the young man's face, and what replaced it wasn't anger but something colder, the astonishment of someone who had never been told no in his life. He asked her what she'd just said to him. Then he bit into one of the pastries, chewed twice, spat it onto the sidewalk, and said it was too sweet to eat. He turned his iced coffee cup upside down and emptied it over the remaining tray. Ice cubes spilled over the edge and rolled beneath the table, while the brown liquid soaked through the parchment paper in an instant. Mari lunged forward to catch the tray. He kicked the leg of the camping table hard with the heel of his boot. The table was old, and its metal joints had been loose for a long time. It folded like a toy, its wooden top slamming against the pavement and splitting in two at the exact corner where the two letters had been carved. The tin money box flew from the tabletop, struck the curb, and burst open, scattering everything she'd earned that morning across the street. Bills fluttered through the air, and coins rolled along the gutter. The three young men turned back toward the vehicle. Mari stepped into the street and bent down to gather the money. She'd picked up 3 bills when the heel of her shoe slipped on the wet maple leaves plastered against the curb, and she fell onto the asphalt, one hand braced behind her and the other clutching the front of her coat. She didn't cry out. She sat perfectly still in the middle of the street, staring straight ahead without seeing anything, her whole body silent as she listened for one thing and one thing alone. Then she felt the slightest movement beneath her palm, a soft, familiar push, the kind her little girl always gave whenever Mari had been standing too long. Mari began to laugh. She laughed aloud, the sound breaking through 2 streams of tears, and whispered, "Yes, I know. You're still here. You're all right." She remained there a little longer, waiting for her breathing to steady. A car door slammed shut. Before getting into the vehicle, the blond young man pulled the $100 bill from his wallet, crumpled it, and threw it into the puddle beside her. He told her that now she had her money and should pick it up. The vehicle backed off the sidewalk, turned, and disappeared around the corner. The bill lay face down in the dirty puddle, its edges slowly darkening. Mari looked at it. She looked at it for a very long time. Then she pushed herself to her feet, stepped over it, and walked toward the broken table lying on the sidewalk. She knelt on the cold concrete and searched through the crushed pastries and the coffee streaming toward the gutter until she found the piece of wood that had broken from the corner of the tabletop, the piece bearing the 2 crooked letters carved far deeper than they needed to be. She wiped it against the hem of her coat. She picked up that piece of wood and left the money exactly where it was in the puddle. After the white vehicle disappeared around the corner, the black sedan parked farther down the street remained idling for a while longer. The man in the back seat hadn't moved the entire time, and the driver had reached for the door handle earlier, only to lower his hand when he saw a single finger rise in the rearview mirror. 1 finger and no words. Now the door opened. The man who stepped out was tall and slender, with hair that had gone prematurely gray at the temples. He wore an unbuttoned gray wool coat, and he walked back up Halloran Street without any sign of haste. He didn't look toward the corner where the other vehicle had vanished. He went straight to the woman kneeling on the wet sidewalk among the ruined pastries, and he stopped at just enough of a distance not to startle her. He removed his wool coat and placed it over her shoulders. Mari looked up. She meant to say something. Perhaps thank you. Perhaps tell him to take it back. But the man didn't wait for an answer. He knelt beside her, directly on the wet concrete, in his dark suit and polished leather shoes, and began picking up the pastries. He worked slowly and methodically, setting the ones that remained intact to one side, brushing the soggy maple leaves from the parchment paper, and using the back of his hand to redirect the stream of coffee toward the gutter so it wouldn't spread any farther. He didn't say a word the entire time. Several people slowed as they passed, then continued on their way. Mari worked beside him, and she realized that this was the first time since spring that anyone had knelt at her level without asking whether she was all right, without telling her everything would be fine, without reaching down to pull her to her feet as though her sitting on the ground were something shameful that had to be ended as quickly as possible. He simply kept picking things up. Once the tray had been set upright again and the pastries that could still be used were neatly arranged upon it, the man reached for the broken piece of wood near the table leg and drew it toward himself. He turned it beneath the light, and then he spoke for the first time. He asked whose initials had been carved there. His voice was so quiet that Mari had to lean closer to hear him clearly, and only later would she understand that it wasn't because he was reluctant to speak loudly, but because for so many years, no one had ever given him a reason to raise his voice. She said they belonged to her husband. The man gave one very slow nod. He didn't ask anything more. He didn't ask where her husband was or why a pregnant woman was selling pastries alone on a sidewalk in October. He only said that the table wasn't broken. It was simply waiting for someone who knew how to mend it. Then he stood and walked a few steps toward the sign, lying face down on the concrete about an arm's length away, the edges of the cardboard already soaked and curling upward. He picked it up, turned it over, and on the back, written in small letters with a ballpoint pen in the lower right corner, was a full name and a telephone number. He read them in silence. He spent longer reading them than a name required. Then he leaned the sign against the tray with the writing facing outward and looked up at the red brick building across the sidewalk, toward the row of fourth-floor windows where the lights had come on in the deepening afternoon. He stood there looking for even longer. Mari didn't know what he was watching. Then he turned back toward her, his eyes normal again, and asked whether she needed someone to take her home. Mari shook her head. She said she lived nearby and could walk. She was still wearing the gray wool coat around her shoulders, and she reached up to remove it and return it to him. The man raised a hand to stop her, very gently, without touching her, only making a gesture in the air. He told her it was about to grow colder. Then he asked for just a little more of her time because there was something he wanted to say. The man took a leather-bound checkbook from the inside pocket of his coat, its four corners worn smooth, along with a pen. He pulled off the cap with his teeth, wrote the name of the bank, wrote the date, and had completed half the name of the payee when he looked up. Mari wasn't watching him. She was bent over the tray, arranging the pastries that remained intact into neat rows, each one spaced perfectly evenly from the next. If one was misshapen, she turned its best side upward. If parchment paper had stuck to another, she carefully peeled it away and relined the pastry with a clean piece taken from the bottom of the tray. She worked quickly and skillfully, and as the man stood there watching her, he understood something. She wasn't arranging them to take home. People didn't line pastries up in rows if they intended to take them home. She was saving them so she could sell them again tomorrow. He watched a little longer, then closed the checkbook, tore the unfinished check from its stub, folded it in half, and then into quarters, and slipped it into his pocket. In its place, he took out a thick ivory business card with no name, no title, and nothing printed on it except a telephone number in the center. He offered it to her between two fingers. Mari took it, turned it over several times, then looked at him. She asked who he was. The man didn't answer that question. He told her to come back tomorrow morning and sell her pastries just as she always did, at the same time and in the same place. And no matter what happened, she wasn't to stay away. He added that if she ever needed to call, she should use that number at any hour, even at 3 o'clock in the morning, because someone would always be on the other end of the line. Then he said goodbye and turned away. He walked down the slope of Halloran Street without looking back, and the driver had already opened the car door before he reached it. Inside the car, seated on the opposite side, was a woman of about 40, with her hair tied low and an unopened document case resting on her lap. Yelena Sokolova had seen everything through the side window, and she'd remained silent all this time. Only when the door closed did she ask why he'd written a check and then torn it up. Emmett Vasiliev leaned back against the seat, with both hands resting on his knees, and looked through the window toward the tray of pastries being covered once more with the checkered cloth. He said that if he gave her a check tonight, she would be able to pay her hospital bills, and he would go home and sleep very well. Then he continued more slowly, saying that the boy would still go to sleep, believing he'd been right. He would wake tomorrow, and the day after that, and next year, and he would still believe that anything he wanted in this town belonged to him. Then another woman would be lying on the ground on another street, and next time, I won't be sitting here to see it. Yelena said nothing. She knew when to leave him alone. The car moved slowly past the front of the hospital, and Emmett turned his head toward the row of fourth-floor windows, keeping his eyes there until the building disappeared from view. He'd been 12 years old then. His mother had lain in the third room from the stairwell, and she'd remained there longer than an uninsured patient was permitted to stay. He remembered standing in the corridor, still holding his wool hat, listening through the opening in the door as his mother spoke to two people dressed in white. She didn't cry. She spoke in English, still marked by the heavy accent of someone who had arrived in the country little more than a dozen years earlier, and she begged them to let her stay for just one more night. She said she would pay. She said there was no one to collect her son. No one struck her. No one cursed at her. No one said a single cruel word. And later, when Emmett was old enough to understand, he realized that this was the worst part of all. They merely stood there, nodded, took notes, and didn't listen. The next morning, they transferred her elsewhere. She died before the week was over. Emmett Vasiliev had spent nearly 20 years after that building something that would ensure he never had to ask anyone for anything again. And that afternoon, He'd sat inside a car with its doors closed and watched a woman on the ground ask a child to give back the $12 he owed her. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he asked Yelena if she was free that evening because he needed her to find a name for him. Mrs. Delphine had packed away her things long ago, but she was still sitting at the corner, and when Mari passed with the tray and the gray wool coat still draped around her shoulders, the old woman pushed herself up on her crutch faster than her age should have allowed. She didn't ask about the table. She asked who the man was who had just knelt down and helped Mari gather the pastries. Mari said she didn't know. He hadn't given his name. He'd only handed her this. Mrs. Delphine took the ivory business card, and Mari saw the old woman's hand hesitate for a heartbeat. She turned it over, studied the number, then returned it very slowly, and told Mari to sit beside her on the step. She said there were names in this town that people didn't speak aloud on the street, and the man who'd just left carried one of them. She explained that he owned a shipyard down by the docks and several freight barges that traveled along the Monongahela River, and on paper, that was everything he owned. Then she said that beyond the paperwork, no one in the 3 counties along that river signed a contract worth anything unless someone had first gone to ask his opinion. Mari asked what people called him. Mrs. Delphine was silent for a moment, then replied that they called him the carpenter. Mari asked why. The old woman looked down at the hand resting on her crutch and said it was because he never smashed anything. He took things apart. He removed one screw at a time, in the proper order, without haste, and he worked with such patience that whatever he was dismantling didn't even have time to realize what was happening until one day it collapsed on its own, and everyone who saw it said it had simply grown too old. Mari remained silent for a long while. Then she stood and said she would bring the coat back tomorrow, and she wouldn't sell here anymore. She said she didn't have much, but she still had this. She'd never owed anyone in her life, and she wasn't going to begin by owing a man like that. Mrs. Delphine didn't object at once. She let those words rest between them for a while, then asked Mari whether she knew what the old woman did on nights when she couldn't sleep. Mari shook her head. Mrs. Delphine told her there was a telephone line that stayed open all night in this town, and she'd worked it 3 nights a week from the time she still had a job until now, for nearly 30 years. She said it wasn't an emergency line. It wasn't a place people called for a ride, and no one dialed it to ask for directions. The people who called were parents. All of them were parents. They called at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when their child was lying upstairs and they'd just been given news they couldn't bring themselves to tell anyone at home. They sat in the parking lot with a telephone pressed to their ear, and they didn't know what to say. She said that during most of those calls, there was nothing she could do. She merely sat in silence and breathed into the receiver, so the person would know someone was listening. She'd sat that way thousands of times, and she couldn't remember a single one of their faces, but she remembered their voices. Then she said that the line didn't keep itself running. Someone had paid for it all those years, every month without missing a single one, and that person had never placed his name on it, never come to pose for a photograph, and never mentioned it to anyone. Mari asked who it was. Mrs. Delphine only replied that in this town, Mari shouldn't ask that question too often, then continued before Mari could ask again. She said she wasn't telling Mari that the man who'd just left was a good man. She didn't know whether he was good or bad. She'd lived long enough to stop dividing people into those 2 kinds. But she would tell Mari one thing she'd learned there. No one in Braddock Falls was clean, child. Not one person. When the mill closed, people made all kinds of promises to one another, and then they all walked away. Only 2 kinds of people remained. Those who paid their debts and those who didn't. The old woman reached over and gently patted the back of Mari's hand. Then she asked whether Mari truly intended to return the table to a man who would spend the entire night somewhere piecing her husband's signature back together. Return it if you feel you must, she said. But tomorrow morning, you're still coming back here, because I want my coffee. The Vasiliev shipyard stood at a bend in the river beneath the old iron bridge, a row of connected buildings, with corrugated metal roofs stretching along the water, and at night, the only lights still burning were the floodlights shining down on the dry dock, and a single small window in the room behind the last workshop. Inside the yard lingered the smell of rust-resistant paint, engine oil, and river water trapped between the hulls of barges raised on supports, and whenever the wind rose from the water, metal clicked and shifted across the roof. The room in back contained nothing but a long wooden table worn pale with age, several mismatched chairs, an electric hot plate for boiling water, and a map of the Monongahela River channels hanging on the wall, its 4 corners yellowed with time. The people seated around the long table that night had worked with Emmett Vasiliev since the days when he'd owned nothing but a barge bought, used, and a debt. One was the workshop foreman. Another managed the docks. One did work that no one ever named aloud. They sat in silence. No one smoked, and no one poured a drink, because there was no alcohol in that room, and never had been. Yelena Sokolova sat at the far end of the table, with the document case in front of her, and she was the only person in the room who dared look Emmett directly in the face. Emmett entered and pulled out a chair, but he didn't sit. He placed something on the table. It was a broken piece of wood about the length of a hand, its edge still jagged with splinters, with 2 initials carved into its surface by a pocket knife. The lines crooked and far deeper than they needed to be. A dark stain of coffee had soaked into the grain. He pushed it into the center of the table. No one reached for it. He said that earlier that afternoon on Halloran Street, 3 wealthy young men had knocked over the table of a pregnant woman, and this piece was what remained of it. He said the woman hadn't begged them for anything, hadn't made a sound, and had left a $100 bill lying in a puddle so she could pick up this piece of wood. Then he fell silent for a moment, long enough for everyone in the room to hear the wind striking the metal roof. He continued by saying that he was about to give one order, and he would give it only once. The boy's name was Brantley Ashcombe. No one was to touch him. Not a single hair on his head. No one was to go to his house, block his vehicle, telephone him in the middle of the night, or do anything they would have to lower their eyes in shame while recounting before a judge. Anyone who disobeyed wouldn't answer to the police. They would answer to him. A man at the far end of the table quietly cleared his throat and said the boy had his father behind him, and in this town, anyone his father called would answer the phone. Emmett nodded and said he knew. That was precisely why he was forbidding it. He said that if they went after the boy tonight, his father would stand before the cameras tomorrow morning and announce that his son had been threatened by thugs from the docks. The entire town would forget what had happened on Halloran Street, and the woman would cease to exist. He said they mustn't give the boy the right to become a victim. Yelena rested both elbows on the table and asked what he intended to do with him instead. Emmett leaned forward, placed both hands on the edge of the wooden table, and stared for a long time at the broken piece of wood lying in its center. Then he said he wasn't going to do anything to the boy. He would build a mirror in front of him as large as the entire street, and he would stand there and force him to look into it. He said men like that feared only one thing in this world, and it wasn't pain or prison, because they were certain those things were meant for other people. What they feared was being seen, standing in the middle of a place where no one shouted, no one raised a hand against them, and everyone watched them in silence, while they couldn't find a single person among them who could be bought. Emmett straightened. He said there was one more thing, then turned toward Yelena. Yelena Sokolova opened the document case, and she didn't need to look down at the papers as she spoke. She said the name on the sign was Mari Kowalczyk, and that alone had been enough for everything else to reveal itself, because in a town this size, there weren't many people with a surname like that. Her husband was Wesley Kowalczyk, a firefighter, and the news had appeared in the local paper in the spring, with a photograph and a full account of the funeral. Yelena said she'd reread every issue from that week in the library archives, and she'd also read the official report released afterward, which anyone could see if they were willing to fill out a request form. There was one detail in that report she hadn't understood, so she'd called the fire department and asked for clarification. Captain Nolan Brechtel had answered the telephone. Yelena paused for a moment before continuing. He'd spoken with her for about 10 minutes, then said, "I'm sorry, I have to hang up." And he had. She said she'd intended to call him again the next day, but had decided not to. Emmett asked no questions. She continued with the insurance. The payment to the family still hadn't been settled because of an exclusion clause in the policy, one that allowed the company to deny the claim if the insured had acted outside the orders of the commander at the scene. She said the case had remained untouched since spring, neither formally denied nor approved, merely suspended in uncertainty, and anyone who'd ever dealt with companies like that knew that leaving a claim pending was more effective than rejecting it, because people couldn't sue something that was still pending. Someone in the room muttered something under his breath. Yelena turned to another page. She said that sometime around the middle of summer, a woman's wedding ring had been sold at a pawn shop on Lorimer Street. The owner still remembered because the young woman had stood outside the window for a long time before opening the door and stepping inside, and because when he paid her, she hadn't counted the money. She'd simply folded it, put it into her pocket, and asked whether he would still have the ring if she came back for it someday. He told Yelena that he'd lied and said yes. Yelena said the ring had been sold in August. She turned another page, then slowed. She said she'd checked the recurring expenses under Mari's name because she needed to know whether anyone was pressuring her over a debt. There were no creditors. There was only one payment, transferred every month without fail from spring until now. Emmett asked who received it. Yelena said it went to the Fire Department Memorial Fund, the fund firefighters contributed to, in order to care for the families of those who had died. The amount wasn't large, so small that she would have missed it if she hadn't searched carefully. Then, in the same ordinary voice she used to read a line from an official report, she continued by saying that during that same period, Mari had missed 2 prenatal appointments, one near the end of summer and another not long ago, and the clinic had noted that the patient requested to reschedule for financial reasons. No one spoke in the room behind the workshop. There was only the wind striking the metal roof, the river water lapping softly against the hull of the barge outside, and the water on the electric hot plate, which had begun boiling some time ago, without anyone bothering to turn it off. The foreman seated near the middle of the table lowered his eyes to his hands. Emmett remained standing and motionless, his gaze fixed on the piece of wood in the center of the table. Yelena Sokolova was the hardest person in that room, a woman who had sat across from every kind of person for years without anyone ever seeing her expression change, and now she closed the document case and turned her face toward the dark window. She remained that way for a while. Then, without turning back, she said that Mari was sending money to other families while she couldn't afford to attend her own medical appointments. Emmett didn't answer. He reached for the piece of wood, brushed the splinters from its edge, and held it in his hand for the rest of that night's meeting. In the lumber shed at the far end of the shipyard, the light was still burning when the sky had faded to the gray that came just before dawn, and Emmett Vasiliev stood alone beside the planing bench, with the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows. He set the walnut board on the support, lowered the blade, and pushed forward with the full weight of his body, one stroke at a time, listening to the steady rasp of wood echoing through the empty shed. Sawdust rose and settled in a thin layer across the white fabric of his shirt and in his hair, and he didn't brush it away. At that same hour, on the other side of town, music was still playing inside a large house on the hill, with enough parking space for nearly 10 vehicles. Brantley Ashcombe sat on the arm of a sofa, holding up his phone for everyone in the room to see, and played the short video for the 3rd time. People laughed. Someone told him to turn it off because they'd already watched it enough. His cousin, the youngest among them, sat in the corner and asked whether Brantley thought he'd gone too far, and what would happen if the woman sued. Brantley lowered his phone, looked at him, then gave a short laugh. He asked whether his cousin knew what the word consequences meant. Then he continued slowly, as if explaining an obvious fact to someone too dim to understand it, saying that consequences were for poor people. The entire room erupted in laughter. No one laughed louder than Brantley. The following night brought no rain, but a heavy mist settled over the town, and Halloran Street was so quiet that the sound of the traffic signal changing could be heard from the top of the hill. The white Range Rover switched off its lights at the end of the street, then rolled toward the curb and stopped a short distance from the table. 2 young men climbed out. They brought what they needed and walked toward the table standing there. A new table with a thick walnut top and 4 steel legs that neither of them had ever seen before, and they began doing what they'd discussed on the drive over. They were about halfway finished when the entire street burst into light. 3 banks of floodlights came on at once, one from the top of the hill, one from the bottom of the street, and one from the alley beside the red brick building across the way. The white light cut across the sidewalk and poured over the 2 figures bent beside the table. There were no sirens, no engines roared, not a single vehicle door opened. Brantley straightened, raised one hand to shield his eyes, and shouted something toward the nearest bank of lights. No one answered. His companion dropped whatever he was holding onto the concrete and stepped backward once, then twice, before stopping where he was, because there was light behind him too. The lights continued to shine. They didn't move, dim, or flicker. Brantley turned in a full circle, and in every direction he looked, he saw nothing but white light and the dark shapes of vehicles behind it that he couldn't see inside. He began to understand something he'd never been forced to understand before that night. No one intended to get out. They didn't need to get out. They were simply standing there watching, and they could continue watching for as long as they pleased. All the names his father could telephone were beyond that circle of light, and none of them could be reached. Brantley backed slowly toward the Range Rover, not daring to turn his back, until he struck the side mirror and fumbled for the door handle behind him. Both young men climbed inside. The engine roared, and the vehicle raced down the slope of Halloran Street, turned sharply at the corner, and disappeared. The 3 banks of lights went dark almost at once, and the street returned to darkness. Not one of the other vehicles moved another yard before morning. When daylight came, the walnut table remained exactly where it had been, its surface dry and unmarked. The object the 2 young men had abandoned lay on its side upon the sidewalk beside one of the table legs, exactly where it had fallen the night before. Pedestrians walked around it. The street sweeper passed and avoided it as well. No one picked it up, kicked it into the gutter, or called anyone to remove it. It remained there throughout the morning, exposed in broad daylight for anyone who cared to look, like a note deliberately left on a table for the owner to read upon returning home. That morning, Mari pushed the cart carrying her trays to the top of Halloran Street, then stopped, and she stood there for a long time before continuing. In the exact place where the camping table had stood for so many months, there was now another table. It was low and sturdy, with a walnut top as thick as the breadth of a hand, 4 box section steel legs bolted to a base fitted with locking wheels, and a canopy of deep green canvas stretched over an iron frame, wide enough to shelter both the person selling and the tray. The tabletop had been finished with a matte varnish, not polished to a shine, the kind of finish given to something meant to be used for years rather than displayed. And in the very center, fitted into the walnut so precisely that a person had to bend close to see the seam, was the old piece of wood bearing the 2 initials carved with a pocket knife, the lines crooked and far deeper than they needed to be. Someone had planed it smooth, removed the coffee stain from the grain, then set it into the new slab as carefully as a gemstone fitted into a ring. Mari ran a finger over the 2 letters. She'd done that every morning for years, but this time, she let her finger remain there for a very long while. Along the front edge of the table, facing the customers, was a wooden sign with letters carved into its surface and filled with white paint. It read, Wren's Bakery. Mari hadn't told that name to anyone. She hadn't told Mrs. Delphine, Dr. Raghunathan, or another soul in the world. She'd only spoken it to her little girl, softly, during the nights she lay on the kitchen floor, and she'd believed it was something private between mother and daughter. Then she remembered. That afternoon on the wet sidewalk, when the man had knelt beside her to gather the pastries, she'd remained sitting on the ground for a while, struggling to catch her breath, with one hand resting over her coat, and she'd said something to the baby. She'd called her by name without realizing anyone was listening. Mari sat on the step beside the table and remained there in silence for a long time. By noon, she'd sold quite a few pastries beneath the canopy, because a fine rain had begun to fall, but the pastries remained dry. Late that afternoon, she pushed the cart to Mrs. Delphine's house, the small home at the end of the row with cracked concrete steps, and asked whether she could use the telephone. She explained that her own phone had been out of credit for several days. The place where she could buy a refill card was at the far end of the street, and she didn't yet want to spend any of the money she'd earned from the pastries. Mrs. Delphine pointed toward the black telephone on top of the refrigerator, then went into the kitchen. Mari took the ivory business card from her coat pocket, pressed each number one at a time, and listened as the telephone rang twice. A middle-aged woman answered and greeted her with a brief sentence that named no organization, merely asking whether someone needed help. Mari said she wanted to speak with the person who'd given her this number. The woman on the other end fell silent for a moment, then asked where she'd gotten it. Mari replied that someone had given it to her on Halloran Street on Monday. Then the other end of the line went silent. It remained silent for so long that Mari had to ask whether the woman was still there. The woman said she was, but her voice had changed and no longer carried the calm rhythm it had at first. She asked Mari's name and the number she was calling from. Mari told her. The woman said to wait a moment and not hang up, just leave the receiver there. Then Mari heard the receiver being placed on a desk, a chair scraping backward, and footsteps receding into the distance. Mari stood holding the receiver in Mrs. Delphine's kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the old woman pouring water in the next room. Then came the sound of the call disconnecting at the other end. She replaced the receiver, unable to understand what had just happened. A few minutes later, the black telephone on top of the refrigerator began to ring. Mari looked at it. Mrs. Delphine came out of the other room on her crutch, but she didn't answer. She stood watching the ringing telephone, then looked at Mari, and only on the 4th ring did she reach for the receiver. She spoke a single word into it, then listened in silence. She listened to several sentences. Then she put the receiver down. Very slowly, She pulled out a kitchen chair and told Mari to sit down. Mari asked what had happened. Mrs. Delphine Arsenault leaned against her crutch and asked whether Mari was sitting yet because there was something she needed to tell her. On Monday morning, the table stood beneath its canopy on Halloran Street, with no one behind it. Mrs. Delphine set up her stand at the corner as she did every day, bought 1 cup of coffee with 2 paper lids as she always did, and left the second lid resting over the mouth of the cup throughout the morning until the coffee had gone completely cold. By the second day, a thin layer of mist had settled across the walnut surface in tiny beads, and when the sun came out at noon, it dried and left behind a faint mark, while the deep green canvas canopy remained stretched above an empty patch of sidewalk. The nurse, who usually bought 2 pastries every morning, stopped and looked at the table before continuing on her way. The unshaven man who had once come through the main entrance stood there for a while, then turned and went back inside. That afternoon, Yelena Sokolova knocked on the door of the half-basement apartment at the bottom of the hill, but no one answered. She went upstairs to ask the landlord, an elderly man repairing a faucet on the porch, and he said Mari had left before dawn on Monday. He'd heard her footsteps on the stairs. She'd been carrying a small suitcase, one of those old hard-shell cases, and she'd given him an envelope containing the rent for the following month, paid in advance more than a dozen days before it was due. Yelena asked whether Mari had said where she was going. The old man shook his head. He said she'd only told him that if anyone came looking, he should say she would return. Yelena called the number written on the back of the sign and heard an automated voice say that the subscriber couldn't currently be reached. She called again to make certain. The message was the same. In the room behind the workshop, Emmett Vasiliev rose from his chair when Yelena finished her report. He walked to the window and stood there, then turned back and asked why they hadn't known. His voice remained as quiet as ever, but it carried something that no one in the room had ever heard before. He asked how they could have people at the docks, people at the warehouses, and people sitting in half the offices in town, yet no one knew when a pregnant woman walked out of her home carrying a suitcase before dawn. Yelena said it was because they hadn't placed anyone to watch her, and she reminded him that he'd been the one to give that order. Emmett stood motionless. Then he said even more quietly that yes, he'd given that order. He sat down again and placed both hands on the table, and for a long while, no one in the room spoke. He told Yelena to find her by any means necessary, as long as no one went to knock on her door a second time. The truth was simpler than anything they imagined, and it began with an envelope delivered to the mailbox of the half-basement apartment the previous Thursday. Inside was a letter printed on the official stationery of an administrative office, written in courteous language and bearing a full signature. It stated that the agency had received an expression of concern from a family member regarding the expectant mother's living conditions, and that, in accordance with procedure, a meeting would be held to discuss and document the matter. The meeting had been scheduled in Harrisburg because the case had been transferred to the regional level. The appointment was on Tuesday. The letter clearly stated that the invited person could bring an attorney if she wished. Mari read the letter 3 times while sitting on the concrete steps, and from the first reading, she knew exactly who that family member was. There was only one person left in the world who could be described that way, and that person had spoken her final words to Mari outside the church in the spring before walking away. Mari didn't call anyone. She didn't go to Mrs. Delphine's house. She sat there, calculated very quickly in her head, and understood that the only thing capable of saving her at that meeting was being there on time, alert, clean, and able to answer every question. She understood something else as well, something more bitter. If she told anyone that such a letter had been sent to her, then from that moment forward, she would no longer be the woman who sold pastries in their eyes. She would become a woman with a problem. So she folded the letter, placed it at the bottom of her suitcase, and before dawn on Monday morning, she walked to the bus station. The bus left Braddock Falls before dawn and traveled throughout the morning through towns that all looked exactly alike, then stopped at a transfer station where Mari had to wait for nearly the entire afternoon to catch the connecting bus to Harrisburg. She'd calculated every cent for this trip, and the least expensive option was the evening bus, the one that traveled through the night and arrived at daybreak, saving her money on both the fare and a room for the night. She boarded the bus during the 33rd week of her pregnancy. She sat beside the window near the middle of the bus, placed the hard-shell suitcase beneath her feet, and tried to sleep. The pain came around midnight, after the bus had left the hills and was traveling along a long, straight stretch of road. It didn't come gradually. It closed around both temples at once and pressed upward behind her eyes. And when Mari opened them, The streetlights outside had blurred into long streaks of light, while the edges of everything dissolved as though someone had drawn a sheet of wax paper across the window. She knew what this was. Dr. Raghunathan had told her about it and warned that if she saw anything like this, she had to come in immediately. She wasn't to wait or think about it. Mari reached for the back of the seat in front of her and sat upright, and two thoughts crowded into her mind at once. The first was that she had to call someone. The second was that, if she did, the bus would stop. They would take her to a hospital in some town whose name she'd never heard. And the following morning, there would be an empty chair in the office in Harrisburg, while the record would state that the invited party had failed to appear without explanation. She could see those words with perfect clarity. She didn't call anyone. She pulled up the cuff of her coat and bit down hard on the fabric, then turned her face toward the window. She began counting the light poles. She counted them one by one as they passed at steady intervals, refusing to allow herself to think about anything except the next pole. She continued until the lights ended, and there was nothing outside but darkness, then began counting the bright reflective markings along the edge of the road. She did that for the rest of the night. By the time the bus pulled into the Harrisburg terminal, the sky was beginning to brighten. Mari descended the steps, carried her suitcase about a dozen paces toward the stone benches in the waiting area, then dropped into a seat and bent forward with both hands braced on her knees. Footsteps approached quickly. One hand supported her shoulder while another steadied her beneath the elbow, and a woman's voice told her to remain seated, breathe slowly, and not try to stand yet. Mari looked up and saw Yelena Sokolova. She managed only one question, asking why Yelena was there. Yelena took a bottle of water from her bag, opened it, and placed it in Mari's hand. She asked whether Mari had truly believed he would let her go alone. She said nothing more. She sat beside Mari on the stone bench and remained there until Mari's vision cleared. The office was on the second floor of an old administrative building with terrazzo floors. The woman who received Mari was named Odette Fairbanks. She had short gray hair and wore a turtleneck sweater, and the first thing she did when Mari entered wasn't to open the file, but to stand and switch on the electric kettle atop the filing cabinet in the corner. She said Mari had traveled all night, hadn't she, and told her to sit while she made her a cup of tea. She poured the water, placed the cup in front of Mari, then took her own seat and opened the file. She used that same gentle voice from beginning to end. She asked about the apartment, Mari's work, what she ate, and where she intended for her little girl to sleep. Mari answered every question without concealing anything, including the parts she knew wouldn't sound good. The meeting lasted about 40 minutes. Then Odette Fairbanks set down her pen, closed the file, and said she'd been doing this work for nearly 30 years. She'd sat across from mothers who had larger homes than Mari, cars, husbands, and everything else. Yet she'd still had to write the words requirements not met in their files. Then she said that in Mari's file, she was writing approved. She pushed the cup of tea a little closer to Mari. Then she told her, "And now, please go and have your prenatal checkup." Word reached Halbert Ashcombe in the middle of the week, and it arrived not as a threat, but as a sentence in a draft contract. His corporation had been pursuing the redevelopment of the old waterfront for nearly 2 years, and the entire project depended on berthing rights and barges capable of carrying materials up and down the river, both of which were controlled by one man. A new clause had been added to the latest draft, and Halbert's attorneys read it 3 times before calling him at 9 o'clock that evening. Halbert telephoned. Yelena answered and told him that Mr. Vasiliev didn't discuss business over the telephone. Halbert called a second time, then a third, and on the third call, Yelena said that a vehicle would come for him. It arrived outside the gates of his house shortly before midnight. The Braddock Falls harbor stood at the widest bend in the river, a long expanse of concrete lined with rusted mooring posts and several old cranes standing motionless against the sky. At night, the floodlights along the shore cast a murky yellow glow across the water that reached only a few yards beyond the bank, while everything farther out remained completely dark. Halbert was led across a gangplank onto an empty barge at anchor, and the sound of his shoes striking the steel deck rang hollow and louder than usual. Emmett Vasiliev stood in the center of the barge wearing his gray wool coat, both hands in his pockets. The river wind blew across them. Halbert began talking, speaking very quickly about the contract, the deadline, and his willingness to renegotiate every financial term. Emmett allowed him to finish. Then he took a flashlight from his pocket, switched it on, and directed the beam straight down into the water beside the barge, where the darkness looked thick and reflected nothing. He asked Halbert what he thought Emmett intended to do to him. Halbert Ashcombe didn't answer. He stood there, and for 3 seconds, he couldn't speak a single word. Emmett switched off the flashlight. He returned it to his pocket and said Halbert would be taken home because the vehicle was still waiting on shore. Then, in the same quiet voice, he asked Halbert what those 3 seconds had felt like. His money was no use to him there. His attorneys weren't there. There was no one he could call, and even if he managed to reach someone, they wouldn't arrive in time. Emmett said that was the feeling Halbert's son had forced a pregnant woman to endure on the sidewalk of Halloran Street, except she'd endured it for 4 minutes, while Halbert had experienced only 3 seconds. Halbert opened his mouth as though he meant to say something, then stopped. Emmett told him to come to Halloran Street at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning and bring his son. He wasn't to bring an attorney, bring anyone to take photographs, or telephone anyone before arriving. Then they would talk. Emmett turned away before Halbert could ask anything else. The following night, in the room behind the workshop, Emmett's uncle sat at the opposite end of the table. Rurik Vasiliev was nearly 70. His hand trembled as he held his cup, and he was the only living person Emmett still called uncle. He read the draft with the new clause, then pushed it aside and asked whether Emmett understood that if the old man refused to sign, several hundred people out there would lose their jobs. Emmett said he understood, which was why he wasn't withdrawing from the contract. He'd only added one clause, and Halbert, not Emmett, would decide whether to sign it. He explained that he'd pledged his own assets, the house and the shares held in his name, so that if the deal collapsed, the workers' wages would continue to be paid until the following summer. Rurik looked at him for a long time. Then the old man spoke a second time, and those were the last words he said that night. He asked whether Emmett remembered that his grandmother had sold her 2 bracelets so he could buy his first barge. Emmett replied that he remembered Uncle. He remembered everything their family had been forced to sell. That was precisely why. When nearly everyone had left, Yelena placed the papers into her case and asked whether they should warn Mari in advance so she could prepare herself. Emmett remained silent for a moment. Then he said no. If she knew, she wouldn't come out. Mari returned to Braddock Falls on Thursday evening, stepped off the bus at the station, and walked home toward the hill. She slept from the moment she lay down until daylight. The first time in months she'd slept through the night without waking. On Friday morning, she returned to selling pastries. She'd managed to bake slightly less than half her usual amount because her hands no longer had the strength to knead, and after standing behind the table beneath the deep green canopy for about 2 hours, she had to sit on the step to rest, then stand again, then sit once more. By noon, she'd sold only a handful. Mrs. Delphine watched from the corner without speaking. The old woman bought coffee with 2 paper lids, as she always did, but carried it over herself instead of waiting for Mari to pass. Late that afternoon, Mari pushed the cart home, never knowing that during her 3-day absence, several things had happened in town that no one thought necessary to tell her. Captain Nolan Brechtel had sent a single line of text to fire crews across the state. There was no explanation, only the words, Wesley Kowalczyk's wife, Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, Halloran Street, bring your wallet. He'd also visited the police station and submitted an application for permission to hold a memorial fundraiser on the sidewalk, the kind of form the fire department filed once or twice each year without anyone bothering to ask questions. Yelena Sokolova had pinned a small white sheet of paper to the bulletin board in the hospital cafeteria. It contained only an address, a time, and one line that read, Homemade pastries, $3 each. Mrs. Delphine had telephoned several members of the church retirement group, and each of them had called a few more people. At the shipyard, Yelena had said only one sentence to the foreman, that the boss had personal business on Halloran Street on Saturday morning, and then she'd walked away. No one received any orders. Saturday morning was cold and clear. It was the beginning of Mari's 34th week, the precise point Dr. Raghunathan had circled for her that day beneath the maple tree. Mari pushed out the cart, placed the tray beneath the canopy, arranged the few pastries she'd been able to make the night before, and leaned her handwritten sign against the table leg. The street seemed quiet. It wasn't the quiet of early morning because that hour had already passed. It was a different kind of silence, like a room where someone had just switched off the radio. No vehicles passed. No one stood waiting for the light at the top of the hill. Mrs. Delphine sat at the corner with both hands resting on her crutch, and she hadn't put out her lottery tickets. Then Mari heard footsteps. They came from the top of the hill, then from the bottom of the street, then from the alley beside the red brick building, and they continued to multiply. People approached slowly and in perfect order, forming a line along the edge of the sidewalk, one behind another, with no one pushing ahead. There were firefighters in uniform, an entire long row of them. There were people in shipyard work clothes, nurses and hospital aides, still wearing identification badges on their chests. Several elderly women in wool hats walking in small groups, and even people Mari had never seen before in her life. The line extended to the end of the first block, curved around the corner, continued past the second, and by the time Mari climbed onto the step to look, it stretched across 3 city blocks. 400 people stood there, and no one shouted a word. No one applauded. Not a single engine roared. Several police vehicles blocked both ends of the street to redirect traffic. 2 officers directed vehicles at the intersection, and 2 more had removed their hats and were standing near the middle of the line. The crowd left a wide open space directly in front of the hospital's emergency entrance, a clear path leading from the street to the glass doors, and anyone who approached automatically moved around it. Not one person stepped into that open space throughout the entire morning. At the very end of the line, behind everyone else, behind the last nurse and the last welder, a tall, slender man in a gray wool coat stood quietly waiting for his turn. He didn't step forward. He didn't signal for anyone to make room. In this town, he was the only man who'd never had to wait in line anywhere. And that morning, he stood in the very last place. Mari stood behind the table and looked at the line stretching across 3 city blocks. And what rose inside her wasn't gratitude. She stepped backward once, then again, until her back struck one of the canopy supports. She looked at the tray in front of her, holding slightly less than half the pastries she would sell on an ordinary day, then looked at the waiting crowd and understood at once that this wasn't a transaction. She raised both hands and told them no. They had to go home because she couldn't accept this. She spoke louder than she intended, and her voice broke in the middle of the sentence. She said she wasn't a beggar. She'd never asked anyone for anything. She only sold pastries, and she hardly had any to sell that day. She pulled the checkered cloth over the tray. She began trying to release the wheel locks beneath the table, but her hands were trembling so badly that she couldn't open the latch. She kept struggling with it, her head lowered, repeating over and over that she was begging them to please go home. The line didn't move. No one stepped forward, and no one spoke to anyone else. That silence was more difficult to endure than if the crowd had closed around her. Then one man left the line and approached. He was about 50, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark uniform with an insignia on the sleeve, and he carried his hat in his hands instead of wearing it. He stopped a respectful distance from the table, and waited until Mari looked up. He said his name was Nolan Brechtel, captain of Company 14. Mari straightened. She knew that name. She'd seen it on a condolence card she'd never managed to read all the way through. He asked her to listen for a moment, and said that if she still wanted him to leave afterward, he would go at once. Then he told her they hadn't come there to give her money. He stopped, and he had to remain silent for quite some time before he could say what came next. He said that on the night of the warehouse fire, when the order to withdraw was given, they assembled in the yard and conducted a roll call. They counted everyone. Someone must have answered for someone else, or someone must have been standing with another crew. He didn't know, and even now, he still didn't know exactly how it had happened, but they'd reported that everyone was accounted for. Then they'd rolled up the hoses. He said her husband had still been inside when they rolled up the hoses. Wesley had called over the radio. He'd called several times. The crew leader's radio had already run out of power, and no one had noticed, while Nolan was standing in the yard checking the roster a second time, and he'd crossed Wesley's name off as accounted for. Someone behind him in the line drew a sharp breath. Brechtel didn't turn around. He said there hadn't been a single shift since spring when he hadn't thought about it. They'd held meetings, written reports, changed the roll call procedure, and done everything people did after something like that. There was only one thing they couldn't do. Not one of them had dared walk up and knock on her door. He said that once, he'd driven to the top of the hill near her apartment, sat in his vehicle, and then turned back. Several of the others had done the same. They'd walked past the place where she sold pastries more times than he could count during the past 5 months, and every one of them had lowered his eyes and continued walking. So she mustn't tell them they were offering her charity, because they weren't that kind. They weren't nearly that good. He raised one hand, and his voice grew hoarse as he said they'd come because they owed her 5 months, and now he was asking her, please, to let them buy 1 pastry. Mari stood there with the wheel latch still in her hand. She couldn't say anything. Nolan Brechtel bent down and placed a firefighter's helmet on the walnut tabletop. It was old, with places where the outer paint had chipped and been carefully restored. The visor had been replaced, and on the front, beneath a layer of clear varnish, the company number and a name in faded block letters remained intact. He said the men of the company had spent the entire summer restoring it. They'd intended to send it to her home, but no one had dared ring the bell. Mari set the wheel latch down on the tabletop. She pulled the checkered cloth away from the tray, folded it into quarters, and said the pastries were $3 each. Captain Brechtel placed a bill on the table, took one pastry, nodded to her, and stepped aside. The next person came forward, then the person after that. No one tossed money onto the table. People paid more than $3. Some paid several times that amount, and others paid even more. But everyone did it in the manner of someone settling a debt, not someone giving charity. An elderly firefighter with completely white hair paused longer than the others. He held the pastry in his hand and said that several years ago, at the warehouse on Ridge Street, he'd been trapped inside and had believed it was over. The man who pulled him out was Mari's husband. Wesley hadn't said a word to him. He'd simply grabbed the strap across the back of his gear and dragged him out. When it was over, Wesley had laughed at him for being so heavy. The old firefighter stopped speaking then. He merely rested one hand on the walnut surface for a moment before walking away. The nurse changing shifts was there, still wearing her identification badge. She took a bite where she stood, looked up, and said this truly was the pastry her mother used to make. She'd told Mari so. Her mother had died when she was 19, and she hadn't eaten a proper one since. She said she would come out and buy one every morning from now on. An elderly woman from the church retirement group placed money on the table, then took Mari's hand without saying anything. A welder from the shipyard, with stains of rust-resistant paint still on his hands, bought two, one for himself and one for his son waiting in the vehicle. The pastries were gone in less than an hour. Mari looked at the empty tray, then at the line that still stretched across 3 city blocks, and began to cry. She said she'd run out. She had nothing left to sell, and they should all go home. Nolan Brechtel was standing nearby, and he merely told her that it was all right because they hadn't lined up for the pastries. No one left. The line remained where it was in silence, and from time to time, more people arrived to join at the end. There was exactly one pastry left on the tray, the one that had broken in half while Mari arranged them that morning, with its 2 pieces lying beside each other on the parchment paper. A boy of about 9 left the line and ran toward her. He wore a blue wool hat pulled down over his ears and a puffy coat that was slightly too large, and he clutched a plastic savings bank shaped like an elephant against his chest. He set it heavily on the table, breathing hard, then politely introduced himself as Ambrose. He said he was waiting for his sister. She was coming home that day, and their mother was inside signing the papers. Then he turned the elephant upside down and emptied it. Coins spilled across the wooden surface with a bright clatter, along with several crumpled bills folded into quarters. He used one hand to gather everything into a neat pile and pushed it toward Mari. He said he'd been saving the money since his birthday and had planned to buy a Lego spaceship set, but he'd heard the adults saying that Mari's baby didn't have a bed. He continued by saying that he could buy Lego anytime, but a baby needed a bed right away, didn't she? Mari looked at the pile of coins on the table. She shook her head and said she couldn't take it. He should bring it home and put it back into the elephant. Ambrose frowned and thought for a moment. Then he asked her to sell him the last pastry instead. That would make it a purchase rather than a gift, wouldn't it? Mari handed him half of the broken pastry, but she still didn't take the money. He held the half in his hand and studied it, then broke it into 2 pieces again and offered one to her. He grinned, revealing new front teeth that hadn't yet grown in evenly, and told her to eat because she had to eat for the baby too. Mari accepted it. She stood there among 400 silent people on Halloran Street and ate the piece of pastry a child had given her, while the boy on the other side of the table chewed his own piece with pleasure and asked whether her baby would be coming soon. The Bentley, a shade of blue so dark it was nearly black, pulled up at the top of Halloran Street at exactly 9 o'clock. It traveled about 60 feet before it had to stop, not because anyone blocked it, but because there was no longer enough room ahead for a vehicle to pass. The driver turned and asked what he should do. Halbert Ashcombe remained silent for a moment, then opened the door and stepped out. He knocked on the opposite rear door and told his son to get out. Brantley emerged wearing sunglasses, both hands in his trouser pockets. Father and son began to walk. The distance from the Bentley to the walnut table was roughly 1/4 of a mile, and they walked the entire way between two lines of people. No one cursed them. No one shoved them. Not a single telephone was raised. People merely remained where they stood and turned their heads to follow. As father and son passed, everyone looked directly into their faces, without hostility or satisfaction, simply looking. And once the two had gone by, the crowd turned forward again. By the end of the first block, Brantley had removed his sunglasses. He slipped them into his coat pocket, took them out again, then put them back. Halfway through the second block, he tried to give a contemptuous little laugh, the kind he used in school corridors and late-night diners, and glanced toward a welder standing nearby, as if searching for someone willing to meet his gaze. The welder only looked back at him. He said nothing. Brantley's smile disappeared somewhere between two maple trees, and from that point onward, he walked with his head lowered. Halbert Ashcombe remained beside his son and looked at no one. When they stopped about a dozen paces from the table, Brantley quietly said something to his father, a brief sentence Mari couldn't hear from where she stood, though Mrs. Delphine, seated nearby, heard it clearly. He said he didn't know why his father was making such a big deal over a few pastries. Halbert Ashcombe turned toward him. He raised one hand. It stopped in the air at shoulder height, and the entire street fell perfectly silent. Then he lowered it. He let the hand fall to his side and stood there breathing for a long time. Without looking at his son, he said that if he struck him now, he would be able to sleep that night. He would go home believing that at least he'd done something. Then he said Brantley hadn't earned that, and neither had he. Emmett Vasiliev stepped out of the line. He didn't offer his hand. He stood facing Halbert and said he hadn't invited him there to apologize to Emmett. Emmett hadn't lost anything. Halbert Ashcombe opened his mouth to deliver something he'd prepared in the vehicle, but the words wouldn't come. He looked around at the line extending across 3 city blocks, the empty tray on the table, and the firefighter's helmet resting at one corner. When he finally spoke, his voice broke. He said he'd taught his son that money could purchase another person's respect. He'd taught him that since Brantley was very small, he'd taught the boy that if he had money, people would defer to him, that he could take whatever he wanted, and that everything else could be dealt with. He said Brantley had learned very well, Mr. Vasiliev. He was the finest student Halbert had ever had. Emmett allowed those words to remain between them for a while. Then he said that today, Halbert would teach him again. More quietly, he added that Halbert didn't remember him. Halbert looked up. Emmett said that one winter, many years ago, when Halbert was still a contractor and hadn't yet constructed a building bearing his own name, he'd sent men to clear a row of rental homes along the river so he could take possession of the land. For 2 days, people's belongings were carried out and left on the sidewalk. In that row was a small apartment occupied by a sick mother and her 12-year-old son. Emmett stopped there. He didn't say anything else about it. Not another word. Halbert Ashcombe stared at him for a very long time, and everyone could see the moment he understood. In that instant, his face turned gray. Emmett turned toward the table, then said he would now tell Halbert 3 things. Emmett began with the first matter. He said that Brantley and the 2 young men who'd been with him would work in the cafeteria at St. Aloysius Hospital until the hospital said they'd done enough, washing trays, wiping tables, and pushing food carts to the different floors. There would be no newspaper article, no photographs, and nothing about it would appear in any academic application. If Brantley did the work to receive a certificate, he might as well not do it at all. Then Emmett told Halbert the second matter. He would establish a fund bearing the name of Wesley Kowalczyk, and it would pay the childbirth expenses of the wives of rescue workers who died in the line of duty. Halbert could contribute as much as he wished, but there was one condition. The Ashcombe name would never appear anywhere in connection with it, not on a document, not on a wall, and not in any interview. Halbert asked why. Emmett replied that if Halbert needed people to know he was good, then he wasn't good yet. Then he turned toward Brantley. He handed him a piece of paper folded in half, bearing the name of an insurance company and a claim number. He said there was a payment that had been pending since spring, and Brantley would recover it. He would do it himself, without his father's money, his father's attorneys, or a single telephone call from his family to anyone. Brantley asked how he was supposed to recover it. Emmett said that was precisely where he would learn something. Then he told Halbert that the clause in the harbor contract would remain exactly where it was until the claim had been resolved, not 1 day sooner. Someone in the crowd raised a telephone. Emmett turned and spoke to the entire street, loudly enough for the people at the back of the line to hear. saying that no one was to record anything. They didn't humiliate people for entertainment. They only taught one another. The telephone was lowered. No one raised another. Afterward, the crowd on Halloran Street slowly began to disperse, and Mari sat down on the step beside the table with the tin box and 2 cardboard boxes in front of her, counting the money. Mrs. Delphine sat beside her and helped smooth each bill flat. When they finished counting, Mari looked up and began to thank them. She pressed one hand against the step and rose, remained upright for the space of a single breath. Then everything before her went dark, and she collapsed forward. Someone shouted. Nolan Brechtel reached her first and dropped to one knee, with 2 other firefighters arriving immediately behind him. They didn't call for a vehicle. The hospital was directly across the street. The 3 men slipped their arms beneath her back and knees, lifted her together in one practiced motion, as though they'd trained for this all their lives, and stepped into the street. The crowd parted in 2. The open path before the emergency entrance, which no one had entered throughout the entire morning, was still there, leading directly from the curb to the glass doors, and they carried her through it without stopping once. In the emergency room, as they prepared to wheel her away, Mari caught hold of a nurse's sleeve. From her coat pocket, she took something wrapped in a carefully folded piece of tissue, its creases worn thin, and placed it in the nurse's hand. She asked the woman to hold it for her. She said her little girl's father hadn't had the chance to see it. Then she smiled and said that when she came out later, the nurse should place it in the bassinet because she wanted it to be the first thing her daughter saw. Ren Kowalczyk was born early that afternoon, small and healthy, and her cries could be heard from the corridor. In one corner of the waiting room sat a man in a gray wool coat with his hands clasped together. He'd been there since Mari was brought inside. He didn't stand when the news came. He didn't walk toward the door. Mrs. Delphine approached on her crutch and sat beside him, then asked why he didn't go in. Emmett looked down at the floor for a while before replying that the little girl would grow up. One day, she would ask her mother who had been standing outside when she was born. He said he didn't want his name to be part of the answer. He stood, left a white envelope at the reception desk containing full payment for every hospital expense, and in one corner of the envelope were only the words, "From a friend of Company 14. In the recovery room, the nurse pulled the blanket up to Mari's shoulders and smoothed its edge. Mari wasn't fully awake yet. With her eyes still closed, she murmured very softly, "It's so warm, sweetheart. You're warm now." 14 months later, a real bakery occupied the small storefront beside the gates of St. Aloysius Hospital, with glass windows, a bell hanging above the door, and a sign that read, "Ren's Bakery." The walnut table stood in the center of the shop. Nothing was displayed on it. No one was permitted to place anything upon it, and the old piece of wood with the 2 initials carved by a pocket knife remained fitted into the middle of its surface. On the wall behind the counter hung a small handwritten sign on which Mari had written, "If someone you love is in the hospital, your pastry is free. Please don't be embarrassed. I once stood where you're standing now." As for Brantley Ashcombe, he didn't become a different person. He remained irritable and still had a habit of walking away before things were finished. And during the first several weeks, he failed again and again. He failed so often that once, he threw the entire file onto the passenger seat and spent the whole afternoon sitting in the parking lot. He telephoned and was transferred from one person to another. He wrote letters and received form letters in return. He went to the office in person, was asked to wait, and was eventually told that the person responsible was busy that day. Around the 6th week, he traced the exclusion clause that had kept the claim pending, then followed it one step farther to discover how it had entered the state's laws. The name waiting at the end of that path was his father's corporation. That evening, Brantley placed the file on the dining table in front of his father and said he would win the case, even if the person he had to sue was Halbert himself. Halbert Ashcombe said nothing. He merely pulled the file closer and began to read. Around the 10th week, the claim was reopened, not because Brantley was clever, but because he refused to give up, and it was the first time in his life he'd ever had to give everything he had to obtain something. He came to the bakery only once, placed the check on the counter without saying a word, then turned to leave. Mari called after him and asked whether he wanted a pastry. He stood at the door for a very long time, long enough for the bell above it to tremble and then fall completely silent, before he nodded. Emmett Vasiliev came one morning, bought exactly 1 pastry, and placed exactly $3 on the counter. Mari took the gray wool coat from beneath the counter, freshly washed and neatly folded, and pushed it toward him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he pushed it back and told her to keep it, because there was no one in his home who needed it. As he was leaving, Mrs. Delphine, seated beside the window, finally asked the question she'd kept inside for so long. She asked why he'd stepped out of the vehicle that afternoon. Emmett stood in the doorway and told her that some 20 years earlier, he'd spent an evening crying in the corridor of the hospital across the street. Beside him sat a little girl eating a pastry filled with apricot preserves, and she'd broken it in half and given one piece to him. He said he hadn't asked her name, and she hadn't told him. He said he knew who she was the moment he saw her, Mrs. Delphine. Her grandmother made that kind of pastry, and everyone in town had eaten one at some point. Then he said that in all the years since, no one had ever given him anything without wanting something in return, except for that one time. That afternoon, when the bakery was quiet, Mari also told Mrs. Delphine for the first time about an afternoon during the previous summer, when she'd sat for a very long while in a waiting room with plastic chairs and a stack of pamphlets on the table. She'd remained there until they called her name a second time. Then she'd stood, apologized, and gone home. She said that at the time, she'd believed she had nothing left to give her little girl except herself. Mrs. Delphine took her hand and told her that was exactly what she'd given Wren. In one corner of the bakery, little Wren was learning to walk while holding onto the legs of the wooden table. And that morning, while the customer in the gray wool coat was still waiting for his pastry to be wrapped, she had toddled toward him and offered a crumb from her tiny hand. He bent down and accepted it. He ate every bit. People often believe that justice must roar before it can be called justice. But on that Saturday morning in Braddock Falls, justice didn't make a sound. It simply stood in line, silent and patient, stretching farther than the street itself, to buy a pastry costing $3 from a woman who had never asked anyone for anything. Perhaps what remains after everything is this: a person's dignity isn't measured by the money in their pocket, but by whether they are willing to stand again after being pushed to the ground. Money can buy many things, but it has never been able to buy respect, because respect is something others choose to give us freely. Kindness is rarely loud. It usually arrives quietly, sometimes as nothing more than half a pastry shared with someone crying beside us, only to return many years later in a way no one could have imagined. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can continue sharing heartwarming stories with you every day. How did this story make you feel about Mari, the man in the gray wool coat, and the silent line of people that Saturday morning? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and days filled with serenity and peace beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.